David Walker's speech to the Massachusetts General Code Association in 1828 added to the large division of slavery that grew between the North and the South. For example, in the 1820s, more and more anti-slavery newspapers appeared in the North, such as the Genius of Universal Emancipation. Walker's speech caused many prominent abolitionist groups to form, such as the Lynn Colored People's Friends Society. In addition, there was an increase in slave runaways, like the well-known Sojourner Truth, who escaped slavery with her child. As a result, the Southern slaveholders tightened the rein on their slaves and took away more of their rights. The response from the South was one of the reasons David Walker published articles such as David Walker's Appeal, arguing his position of maintaining an anti-slavery society. In addition, the Second Great Awakening impacted Walker the most significantly with the ideas of revival and condemning sins. Because of his strong belief in God, as well as his attempts to encourage violence towards slaveholders, Walker was prompted to write The Necessity of a General Union Among Us in 1828. Walker was an African-American abolitionist who was a devout Christian and referenced God in his anti-slavery appeals to justify uniting the black population. Born from a slave father and a free mother, Walker inherited his mother's status as a free black. He received an education and then settled in Boston. The fact that he lived in an environment where there were so many citizens who protested slavery probably inspired his support for the anti-slavery movement and his contribution to Freedom's Journal, which was the first black-owned and operated newspaper in the United States. Walker was most well known for his appeal, David Walker's Appeal in 4 Articles, which was published from 1785 to 1830. In his appeal, Walker pushed for immediate emancipation instead of a gradual approach taken by many white abolitionists. Walker referenced the Declaration of Independence when he stated, "See your Declaration, Americans. Do you understand your own language? Hear your language proclaimed to the world July 4th, 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Walker answers his appeals to slave owners, abolitionists, and especially to the Southern slaves. He warned that there would be a slave revolt if the slave owners did not free their slaves soon. Walker's belief that God would guide the slaves to freedom has stayed consistently throughout his career as an abolitionist. This is shown when Walker declared, "For you must remember that we are men as well as they. God has been pleased to give us 2 eyes, 2 hands, 2 feet, and some sense in our heads as well as they. They have no right to hold us in slavery than we have to hold them. We have just as much right in the sight of God to hold them and their children in slavery and wretchedness as they have to hold us, and no more." This showed that Walker had constantly referenced God with the hope that the slaves in the South would fight for their freedom. According to Walker, slave owners and slaves were all creations of God. Thus, it was unfair that the slaves were not given the same privileges as the white American citizens. He even claimed that the slaves had the same right to hold the slaveholders in slavery because they were equal. Throughout the 1800s, slavery remained a contentious and complicated issue. There were several figures in history who influenced the public opinion on slavery, such as Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison. For example, Douglass was so eager to liberate slaves that he encouraged abolitionists not to go to church or vote because the churches were not taking an active role in stopping slavery. Walker took some of Douglass's ideas, but also encouraged the slaves to serve violence on the plantations. Garrison also believed that blacks were American citizens and entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Garrison claimed, in no compromise with the evil of slavery, that abolitionism, which I advocate, is as absolute as the law of God and as unyielding as his throne. It admits of no compromise. Every slave is a stolen man, every slaveholder is a man-stealer. Garrison and Walker shared the ideals that God was the most supreme authority and that they had to promote violence because the slaveholders were just going to use more force against the slaves if they were disobedient. The abolitionists had to fight back with more violence. In addition to the important political figures in the 1820s who were anti-slavery, there were also many events that inspired Walker to write the speech. For example, when Congress made Missouri a slave state and admitted Maine as a free state in the Missouri Compromise of 1820, it set the precedent that the number of the slave states and the free states had to be equal. Otherwise, this expansion of slavery in the West would inevitably lead to the secession by the South or the North. Because the tension between the South and the North was quickly rising, Walker realized it was the most important time to ask for the Northern abolitionists and the slaves to unite. The Second Great Awakening was also important in raising this anti-slavery issue when there was an emphasis on the performance of good deeds and the salvation of one's sins. The awakening had a large impact on the slaves and abolitionists because it made them realize that slavery was a sin, and in order to comply with God's directive, they must end slavery. In Walker's speech, it was clear that he attempted to unite the colored population to fight for their independence from the the Southern slave owners. Walker recognized that there were restrictions implied in the Constitution that the African Americans could not cross. According to the Three-Fifths Compromise in the Constitution, Americans did not consider black people as humans, and therefore not entitled to the protection of the law. Walker argued that the slaves should not be degraded and should be treated with dignity. However, Walker stressed that the disunity of the African Americans blocked them from being reasonable and thinking beings. Walker declared that this disunity has been too long and that it was time for the blacks to be united. Throughout the speech, Walker constantly referenced God to persuade the readers and the slaves that God wanted the end of slavery. He spoke about how God's invisible arm must have been stretched out in our behalf. Because Walker and the president of the Massachusetts Association both believe in God, Walker's references to God seemed to be more persuasive than that the fight to end slavery was what God had intended. In the speech, Walker called for the slaves to look to God for guidance to escape from their sufferings and torture.
I ask you in the name of God and of Jesus Christ, shall we suffer such notorious villains to rest peacefully among us? Will they not take our wives and little ones, more particularly our little ones, when a convenient opportunity will admit, and sell them for money to slaveholders, who will doom them to chains, handcuffs, and even unto death? May God open our eyes on these children of the devil and enemies of all good.
Walker also wanted the president of the Massachusetts Association to know that God would help the African Americans because they had suffered long enough. Again, this reference to God was meant to send the message that the emancipation of the slaves was inevitable as it was God's will. In addition to his dependence on God to unite the slaves, Walker wanted to work with the Northern abolitionists to assist in the emancipation of slaves. He recognized that there were good people in the nation who also wanted equal rights for every person. Walker declared that if the slaves cooperated with abolitionists, the alliance would promote unity in the nation. Walker acknowledged that the abolitionists were gifts from God to assist in the efforts to bring the African Americans together by creating societies to spread the anti-slavery protests. Walker also wanted the president of the Massachusetts Association to know that God would help the African Americans because they had suffered long enough. Again, this reference to God was meant to send the message that the emancipation of the slaves was inevitable as it was God's will. In addition to his dependence on God to unite the slaves, Walker wanted to work with the Northern abolitionists to assist in the emancipation of slaves. He recognized that there were good people in the nation who also wanted equal rights for every person. Walker declared that if the slaves cooperated with abolitionists, the alliance would promote unity in the nation. Walker acknowledged that the abolitionists were gifts from God to assist in the efforts to bring the African Americans together by creating societies to spread the anti-slavery protests. In this speech, Walker also attempted to provoke harsh reactions from the readers as well as the slaves who were affected. It is important to note that most slaves did not have the privilege of learning how to read speeches like Walker's, so they had to be read to by older slaves who had more experience. In most of the South, slaves and even free blacks were legally banned from preaching, but they held their own religious services regardless, often at great risk to themselves. Walker wanted the slaves to recognize and acknowledge their anger and frustration, so he emphasized and exaggerated the way their owners felt about them. According to Walker, Southern slave owners enjoyed making the slave wives miserable. To make slaves even more enraged, Walker said,
Those are very humane, philanthropic, and charitable men who proclaim to the world that the blacks are such poor, ignorant, and degraded species for the want of something to subsist upon, and in consequence of which they are compelled to keep them in bondage to do them good.
This clearly shows that in Walker's opinion, Southerners did not view slavery as inhumane. To the contrary, the slave owners thought that if they liberated the slaves would not know what to do with themselves because they were so poor and ignorant. Therefore, by withholding their freedom and keeping them as slaves, the slave owners believed that they were performing a good deed. In the speech, Walker blames those who delight in our degradation for the suffering of the slaves. While he did not identify the wrongdoers, the implication was obvious that he was talking about the Southern slaveholders. He did not want to explicitly blame the slaveholders because he knew there would be grave consequences. He knew that the slaveholders would respond by prohibiting the slaves from learning to read and write, another one of their given rights that would be taken away. The slaveholders might even take it a step further and resort to violence, which they did often. Walker intentionally delivered a speech at the association in order to motivate the members to take more action to liberate the Southern slaves. Walker did this because most abolitionists were reluctant to take any violent action. They wanted a slow, gradual change. The abolitionists did not want to instigate a war with the South, so they protested peacefully by setting forth their beliefs in the newspapers and pamphlets. The letter to the association caused both positive and negative reactions from American citizens, and encouraged slaves to rebel against their owners. Walker's speech instilled a sense of pride in the slaves and gave them hopefulness of freedom. In addition to slave runaways, it led to Northern abolitionists to establish anti-slavery newspapers, such as The Liberator in 1830. It is interesting to note that some abolitionists and free blacks did not support Walker's speech because they believed it to be too radical. Nonetheless, it convinced many reluctant Northern free African Americans who did not want to risk getting caught and taken back to the southern plantations to help the slaves cross over into the Northern Territory. In contrast, the southern plantation owners realized they had to tighten their control on the slaves, thus established laws that prohibited slaves from learning to read and banned the distribution of Walker's speech. David Walker's speech on uniting the slaves and making them fight for their freedom has influenced many Northern abolitionists and Southern slaves to take action to spread anti-slavery. Walker's continuous use of God throughout his speech was extremely effective to convince the president of the Massachusetts General Code Association to increase the protest for the emancipation of slaves. He also declared that slaves share the same rights as white citizens in the United States. Further, Walker's reference to God's will that all people, regardless of color, be equal and his expressed anger against the inhuman treatment endured by the slaves easily persuaded many slaves in the South to unite and fight for their freedom.